Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this public lecture hosted by the Peking University School of Transnational Law, Beijing 大学国际法学院, located in Peking University Shenzhen Graduate School, Beijing 大学 Shenzhen 理科生院. Thank you all for coming. It's our great pleasure and honor today to have with us Dr. Akshaya Kamalnath, who serves as senior lecturer at the Australian National University College of Law. Professor Kamalnath is an expert in corporate law, corporate governance, corporations and society, corporate insolvency, and often also works on comparative corporate law. She's widely published in leading journals and also writes prolifically also online and blogs, for example, at the very well-known Hitchhiker's Guide to Corporate Governance website. She also has a forthcoming book entitled The Corporate Diversity Jigsaw, parts of which we'll be very excited to hear from today. And Professor Kamalnath will be speaking today on two important pieces of the corporate diversity jigsaw, the meaning of diversity and its relevance to corporate governance. And before I turn the floor over to Professor Kamalnath, just two housekeeping issues. The first is the format of today's public lecture. Professor Kamalnath will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, after which we'll open the floor to questions. The second issue to inform everyone is that this lecture is being recorded by the Peking University School of Transnational Law. So I wanted to make sure that everybody knew that. With those matters out of the way, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Akshaya Kamalnath to speak to us today. Thank you again very much, Professor Kamalnath. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to apologize to begin with, because there's going to be some sounds in the background like this. The windows make this noise when the CO2 levels increase or whatever. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited about doing this. It's my first pre-publication talk, so I'm glad to be getting started with talking at your university. And I'm going to talk about this upcoming book called The Corporate Diversity Jigsaw. And let me begin by explaining the title a little bit, because almost everyone, no matter what area you specialize in, or if you're not an academic and work in a business or a company, you've probably seen discussions on diversity in the news media, popular or in university contexts, etc. So as someone who's been researching diversity in the context of corporate law and corporate governance, I felt that we're constantly focusing on a few issues, but not focusing on many other issues in our policy discussions, which are ultimately flowing into legislation or corporate governance rules, requirements, etc. So this book is mostly to talk about the basics, but also to fill those gaps about what we're not talking about. So I imagine it like a jigsaw puzzle where we just have 2 or 3 pieces of the puzzle and we keep making policy solutions based on that. But I think we need to have some of the other pieces as well. And in today's talk, I wanted to focus a lot on the first chapter and a little on the second chapter. So the first chapter talks about just defining diversity, because I think we're not really doing a very good job of defining diversity as it is generally in discussions and in legislation or policy that feeds into legislation. So since I'm looking at diversity in the corporation, I have a specific view of what I would need diversity for in the corporation. But if I speak to someone else about my research, they tell me, oh yeah, there's this thing about diversity in the judiciary or diversity in society generally, or somebody was talking about diversity in publishing, how you need to have, somebody said edited collections should have diverse chapters by authors from different backgrounds or gender. And so it looks like we're all kind of talking about probably different things. So maybe the first thing to do is to look at the dictionary and see that what do we even mean by diversity when we're talking so much and making so many prescriptive rules about this. And the Oxford English Dictionary didn't give me a very satisfactory definition. It just said a range of different things. I mean, it's good enough, but it doesn't help. I looked at the Cambridge English Dictionary and it's a little more helpful. It has two different definitions of diversity. Or rather two pointers within the definition of diversity, I guess, what I call as prong 1 and prong 2. So prong 1, and I'll read that out, it says, the fact of many different types of things or people being included in something, a range of different things or people. So I kind of read this to mean demographic diversity, if we're thinking about different types of people. And prong 2, it says the fact that there are many different ideas or opinions about something. And I read this prong 2 as what in the US is being called viewpoint diversity. In the UK, the corporate governance code uses the term cognitive diversity, but I think we could in my book, I use the two terms interchangeably, but in the US, when you say viewpoint diversity, sometimes, especially in the corporate governance context, it can mean something more narrow. So it can mean a political ideology, so conservative views and progressive views, whereas cognitive diversity, I like it better because it kind of allows you to say different ideas on anything. If you're thinking about a problem, you can have many different ideas on that problem, irrespective of the politics behind it. So using this initial, the definition I get from the Cambridge English Dictionary, I build a kind of matrix to say, okay, within the corporation, we have many different levels. So when do you need prong 1 diversity, that is demographic diversity? And when do you need prong 2 diversity, that is viewpoint or cognitive diversity? And before getting into those sorts of things, I also want to talk about within prong 1 diversity, when we talk about demographic diversity itself, there seems to be a more narrow version of it. Most people, when we talk about diversity, would probably just think we refer to gender diversity, especially on corporate boards, which is what all the legislation has been about. It's only recently that we've seen some US legislation starting to reference race and some other factors. So these categories of demographics also are kind of not very distinct. And we run into the problem of, and I go into this a little in later chapters where I talk about the rules, so specific laws in different countries. So if you have laws that say we want to prioritize or promote certain types of diversity, then you can have other groups saying why is our group not prioritized? So it could be, yeah, within race, gender, there could be a bunch of different groups again. But even outside, you could say, what about age diversity? What about diversity of geographical origin? So should you have people, even if they're from different countries, if they're all kind of acclimatized or served in companies in, say, the US, then they're all speaking with American accents. So is that diverse enough? So you can have a lot of that even within prong 1. And prong 2, I think, is quite useful in different ways in different levels of the company when you're thinking about where you want viewpoint diversity and what sort of viewpoint diversity at each level. So at the board level, at the management level, and in the workforce more generally. And here, there is this discussion even currently in the policy debates, but it's kind of fused together. So when we talk about the rationales for why we need diversity in the corporation, usually the board, people usually give us two rationales. One is it's to promote equality, and the second is to say that if you have diversity, so for example, in the context of gender diversity, which is what most of the literature is about, you have arguments saying women directors can bring different perspectives to the board. So there is some conflation of prong two there within prong one, but there's a number of studies that actually, like quantitative studies, that I analyze in chapter 2 and show, and these studies actually say that having women directors on the board might not necessarily bring different views to the board, and this is probably because they came from the same universities, served on the same committees, went through the um, uh, same channels to pipelines to get to those positions. Whereas there was a study in Norway where suddenly you had a quota legislation saying that all companies should have at least 40% directors on the board, 40% women directors on the board. So then those women appointed as a result of that law, this is a study by Professor Aaron Deer, who interviewed directors in Norway, both male and female directors, and they said the women directors added new perspectives, sometimes asked more questions which enhanced the discussions, etc. So when I compare these two sets of studies, what I think could be the difference is what we call liminality, or outsider status of these women directors that were suddenly appointed as a result of the new law. So if you came from a different background without the same sort of being used to the same sort of decisions in similar contexts, then you probably asked more questions. You probably prepared more for a meeting when you didn't have that background. So probably that helps a little that way, but it's not necessary that you will have different perspectives whenever there's women on the board. And I kind of draw from these studies to show that you could have similar results with race diversity, or age diversity, or different geographic origins, people from different geographic origins, to bring different ideas to the board. So I've in discussing prong two, I've started getting into one level of the corporation, that is the board, and that's because this is most usually discussed, and this is where all the action seems to be in terms of legislation and corporate governance rules. We want, usually it seems that we want to have diversity on the board, and part of it seems to be, although the official reasons are for equality and for these sort of business benefits, as it's called, but what they call diverse perspectives, there is also this idea of reputational gains and signaling that you're now having you're now addressing stakeholder preferences and having more women on the board, or maybe racial minorities on the board. So there's a bit of that signaling happening when you have diversity at the top. But in chapter 1, I talk about how there are two other levels, that is the management, which in large companies is just as important, sometimes even more, because they're which is just as important, perhaps even more, because they're in charge of day-to-day operations. They make a number of decisions that could benefit from diverse views. So with the management level, which we don't look at all, the level just below the board, viewpoint diversity is very useful. So prong two diversity would be very useful there as well. Perhaps there is some amount of the what I called signaling at the board level, but what I'll switch a little and call role models, logic to having both gender and diversity in terms of racial minorities or other types. So just making it more open for different types of people to be on those management positions, so that the rest of the rank and file can see that, look, there is a way to reach these positions no matter who you are. So there's that, which is the role model effect, which is quite valid at the management level as well. And at the rest of the corporation, which we don't talk about too much, I think both and possibly prong one could be more important, because for one thing, you want to have both women or racial minorities or other types of diverse people. You want them to be able to access positions within the corporation, so gain entry, and then you want proper systems in place that help to suss out who are the talented candidates and finding ways to retain them, irrespective of whether they belong to these, whatever the dominant group is. And sometimes in the workforce, it's not so much about the demographics, but rather whether you fit within certain networks. There's research to talk about people who go on smoke breaks with their bosses get promoted sooner. It just so happens that a lot more of them were men and they got promoted sooner. But there are these other factors that come into play when you start looking at the research in more detail. So I think prong one is important to ensure when we keep talking about equality. I think the real deal is to look at whether the rest of the corporation, the workforce in general, is there a culture that promotes talent, whether irrespective of who they are. And with respect to prong two in the workforce, we don't speak about this too often, but I think it's also important because when you have widespread misconduct in an organization, think of something like Volkswagen, the emissions issue, or something is being concealed, there's usually a lot of people that are in the know and not saying anything. So if you have channels within the corporation where people can report something they don't agree with, and that goes right up to management or the board, perhaps there's a way to prevent that. And that's part of what I talk about in chapter 2, which helps enhance the monitoring role of the board. But also it can give ideas to board and management. So for example, Amazon's, the Amazon Prime idea came from one of the employees who put the idea in a suggestion box. Just saying it to your team, if it's not appreciated, maybe there are ways to ensure that you can get views of employees who have different ideas up to the top. And some of them may be useful, some of them may need to be addressed. They may point to serious issues within the firm, whether it's misconduct in terms of non-compliance or sexual harassment, like we saw in the Uber case when something came out and then they had a big review and saw that there was a culture that allowed this. So I think allowing for prong 2, that is different views and ideas to be expressed and to be heard, actually helps companies deal with issues ex ante rather than wait ex post for something to come out in the news and deal with the reputational hazards of it as well. So I also so some of the things that I probably want to mention, even though it's not part of chapters 1 and 2, but just to give you a flavor of the rest of the book, is to talk about some other forces adding to the diversity conversation in recent times. So like the Me Too, Black Lives Matter movements coming up through social media. In the book, talk about it all as a kind of stakeholder push or engagement through now the new technology of social media that corporations have been responding to, and thinking of diversity in terms of corporate responses to issues after the fact, like I was saying now, is kind of short-sighted as against thinking through and strategizing about how the firm can promote diversity at all levels, and both in terms of prong 1 and prong 2. And The other thing I think that must have come through in what I'm talking about in terms of workforce diversity is that we need to focus on the culture of a firm. Does the culture promote diversity? Does the culture shut down views that are different from the rest? So I would include in prong two, although I said that I'm not thinking of it as exclusively political one way or the other. Does a company's culture suggest to some employees that they need to not talk about their views on certain issues while the rest of the employees are free to talk about their views? I think all of this goes to what we are now calling inclusion, because whenever we talk about diversity now, we hear DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Although my book just uses the term diversity, I do use ideas of inclusion when I talk about corporate culture. With equity, I think I would argue for equal opportunity rather than equal outcomes. And so I think that's mostly what I'm getting at through the having a culture that retains talent, etc. And the one chapter that looks at laws dealing with diversity basically criticizes the fact that we have these one size fits all laws saying you need to have X number of women or other types of minorities on the board, without really looking at how the law can have some adverse impacts. So to just mention a few adverse impacts of such sort of diversity laws, you could have diverse board directors or people at the rest of the firm being treated as tokens, or like they didn't actually deserve the position they held. And I think these are all some of the minefields that having diversity policies and diversity laws should be careful about, because in effect, the people we are trying to help may actually be harmed by these sorts of laws. And yeah, those are the sorts of issues the book is looking at. And I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, and then I'll decide what else to talk about.
I think still have let me just you could still have 10 to 15 minutes actually.
Okay, so the one thing in chapter 1 that I get into, which I ran through very quickly, is the rationales for diversity that we have so far. And these are the rationales that if you look at laws, say in European countries with the quota laws, or even in the US, a lot of the times the rationales being mentioned are broken into two. One is equality, and what I've mentioned so far, I think I've spoken a little bit about equality within the firm, but I think there is also discussion of how you have structural barriers. So there is more of family care responsibilities thrust on women rather than men, and firms have to accommodate this. I do discuss some of that, but I also think there are other solutions for those problems, and a company or company law alone can't address those societal issues. But other structural barriers, like within the company, the idea of who an ideal worker is in a firm, that I think reflects our societal framework in the past, where you had one male breadwinner and the person's wife being able to take care of everything else at home. And so that has resulted in a culture where, especially as you look at management levels, you need to be on call for most of the day. You need to be able to travel at very short notice. And some of the things come through when you look at business people's biographies. Most recently, I read Indra Nui's book where she prominently discusses these issues. And I think firms can, and I discussed some of the remote, as we were talking just before we started the seminar, that we've started doing some things remotely, hybrid meetings, and after COVID, and firms have been doing that as well. And many firms realized during COVID that we could actually have um, allow people to work remotely for certain periods of time. And so I think flexible working could be something that's more palatable now in firms after COVID, but that's one of the structural barriers that I think firms can help and address. Anyway, so that's under the umbrella of the equality rationales. Under the business rationales, I have deliberately only mentioned the good for business in terms of you bring diverse candidates, bring different perspectives, but it's because I only like or think these are the sensible ones, because the rest of the business rationales rely on studies, quantitative studies that are usually just correlations, which look at if there are more women on the board, there were increased profits in these number of years. And you have plenty of studies that also show negative profits, but those are never spoken about. And you usually have this sort of selective show of quantitative studies. And I think this is kind of harmful to promote these studies. And then it results in a lot of pressure to the diverse candidates that you appoint on the board, because why hasn't the profits increased after appointing these diverse candidates would be a question we have to face a few years down the line. So I would resist all those aspects of the business case, but really carve out a few arguments which I call as the corporate governance case for diversity. And part of that is what I was mentioning as bringing different perspectives, but I like what Professor Erica Beecher-Monas talks about in the context of corporate governance. So far, we were talking about independent directors solving a lot of problems, solving a lot of conflicts, but independent directors, and most jurisdictions have requirements to have independent directors on board committees or decisions, board committees which make certain important decisions. But are these independent directors really psychologically independent, is the question that many authors have asked. But this is Professor Beecher-Monas' phrasing, that do we really have psychological independence? Because these are directors that go to the same clubs, they belong to the same social groups, they feel like they need to support each other and agree with each other. This is what we call groupthink in boards. They feel strengthened by each other's agreement with a certain decision, and that can actually push them to a more extreme position. So are we really having people who are independent in terms of having different views? But that's just the first thing. In prong two diversity, we talk about different views, but the second part of it is, are we encouraging those views? And are people, if you have one person with a different view on the board, are they likely to self-censor themselves and agree with the rest, or are they likely to voice their views? And there's been some research on this, with some suggesting you should have something like a devil's advocate, where one director always discusses the other course of action or point of view, so that the board actually thinks of other possible solutions. But in practice, it's very difficult for a close-knit group to challenge each other. So those are the sort of things that diversity can help, but really it's up to the board chair to bring out or encourage these sort of views. And very similarly, I think what the latest, almost, I want to say, use the term fad, but in the US, it seems to be that every company is now hiring a chief diversity officer. And so you've now elevated the position to a C-suite position. So it shows the firm is committed to diversity, etc. But there's a number of interviews of these diversity officers that actually say that they don't have the resources or the authority that they would need to bring about any kind of change. So it's more like it's almost like something we've done to signal to the market that we're interested in diversity, but we're not actually changing our culture, giving that diversity officer the power to make changes. So I think that's another aspect that we're talking about chief diversity officers a lot, but we're missing the substance of it. So again, we're getting into doing these sort of positive things in form only, but probably not in substance. So in chapter 2, where I talk about corporate governance, what diversity in corporate governance, I basically talk about both the board and management. And towards the end, I mentioned chief diversity officers because as I was writing the book, it had really become every day there was a story about a new company appointing a chief diversity officer. So there was a study in the university sector that showed that despite appointing diversity officers in universities, it didn't really change the composition of new hires. And I guess that study was only looking at prong one diversity, but even that didn't improve. And the authors their conclusion was that it was probably because the diversity officer didn't have enough influence in the decision making. And I think the same learning seems to flow into corporations, where if diversity officers are saying that they don't have enough power to do what they wanted to actually do, the authority or the resources. I think I could stop here and open it up for discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Kamalnath, for that very enlightening presentation. And if I could just add my 2 cents, for me it was really good to listen to learn, because as you mentioned, these terms, diversity, equity, inclusion, have been thrown around so much, especially in the US, and there's been definitely a rush for every institution to seemingly hire, and then, for lack of a better word, show off, chief diversity officer or their new DEI office. And it's, I like how you interrogate and investigate these terms, diversity, in a very nuanced and multifaceted way, because I think it's important, rather than just what we see some institutions doing is just putting up the diversity badge or sign, but not really interrogating what that means or what that should mean. So I think what we'll do is we're going to stop the recording now for the Q&A part.